This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
They were doing the work that every American should be doing with somebody, right? And they were doing it with respect because they knew each other. They hung out. They stayed at the table, which is the number one formula. They stayed at the table. And they did it with the two words that I think of that I think should be part of American culture are forbearance and fortitude. And they completely disagreed at a certain level. And yet what they stayed in is we both care about access and we both care about fairness. I'm like, okay, let's begin there. You know this as a mediator all the time, right? You just state the basics and see if you can stay in the basics for a little while. And they were finding a way to say something.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. So good to be with you again. And thank you for joining us for our Common Purpose with Dr. Laurie Patton. Village Squarecast is funded in part by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with support from the Mellon Foundation and Florida Humanities. In this special edition of UNUM, Democracy Reignited, Village Square founder and my friend Liz Joyner and longtime civic leader Steve Seibert sit down with Dr. Laurie Patton, president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Together, they explore how the Academy's landmark initiative, Our Common Purpose, calls us to strengthen democracy through civic renewal, pluralism, and shared purpose. It's a conversation that reminds us that democracy isn't something we inherit, it's something we practice together. Stick around after the program. I'll be back to share a few reflections before we wrap up. And now, let's join Liz, Steve, and Dr. Patton as they dive into Our Common Purpose.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Joyner. I'm founder and president of the Village Square. On behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to UNUM. And our program is Our Common Purpose with Dr. Laurie Patton. This program is made possible by funding from Florida Humanities. It's part of a multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM Democracy Reignited, presented in partnership with Florida Humanities, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. Now it is my pleasure to introduce or reintroduce a dear friend of the Village Square, our former board chair, Steve Seibert. Steve is the current vice chair of the Pinellas Community Foundation. He's the former executive director of Florida Humanities, served under Governor Jeb Bush as the secretary of Florida's Department of Community Affairs, and served 2 terms on the Pinellas County Commission, a Florida Supreme Court mediator for over 30 years. Steve gained a statewide reputation for helping resolve contentious public and private sector disputes and has been named one of Florida's legal elite by Florida Trend magazine. In his long career, Steve has received appointments from four Florida governors and from the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. Steve, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
My personal opinion, you should have never gone away.
Well, I appreciate that.
You actually kind of didn't. One of the things about the Village Square that's so wonderful is that we sort of develop a network of humans that we stay with all the time, we talk to all the time. You and I are always trying to figure things out. And so this evening's program is going to be no exception, I think.
Thank you, Liz.
And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our very special guest tonight, Dr. Laurie L. Patton. She is the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is the author or editor of 11 books and more than 70 articles in the field of South Asian history, culture, and religion, and on religion in the public square. Dr. Patton has also lectured widely on interfaith issues and religion in public life, and she has consulted with White House Office on faith-based initiatives and civic engagement. Prior to the Academy, Dr. Patton served as the president of Middlebury College, the first woman to lead the institution in its 224-year history. Her leadership at Middlebury brought a signature initiative on conflict transformation, where skills in addressing conflict are understood as a necessary part of the 21st century education. Previously, Dr. Patton served as the dean of Duke University's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, Go Heels. And prior to that, she served on the faculty administration at Emory University, where she served as the chair of the religion department. Dr. Patton earned her BA from Harvard University and her PhD from the University of Chicago. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2 categories: philosophy, religion, and educational leadership. Since becoming president, Dr. Patton has been focusing the Academy's initiatives on building and maintaining democracy through the cultivation of thought leadership. And that is, in fact, why we had to bring her here tonight. Welcome, Dr. Patton.
It's great to be here. An honor to talk with you.
I clearly can't introduce anyone from Duke without saying that I'm from Carolina. So that may be the division we can't bridge.
We're going to talk about agonistic democracy, I am sure. And so that works out really well.
All right. So to get us rolling, you lead an extremely important institution with a truly storied history and mission. It's deeply inspiring. See, I'm going to start tearing up already. Tell us more about the Academy of Arts and Sciences.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And we are just about, this week is our induction week, so we're just about to bring together our new fellows with their families to celebrate them. Some of their letters that you see behind me are their letters of acceptance. And it's an incredible place to be at this moment. But the Academy didn't always look like it looks behind me. It was founded in 1780. And if you know anything about American history, and I know pockets here and there, I'm not an American historian, but I did grow up in Salem Village, now Danvers, Massachusetts. And so that has deeply informed my understanding of American history. 1780 was one of the worst years of the Revolutionary War. You had Charleston being taken and some of the highest casualties. You had a revelation of Benedict Arnold's treason, and you had mutinying soldiers in Connecticut. We were also starving. It was a really tough year. And so one could imagine forgiving the country's founders, just having them focus on what was at hand and doing crisis management. But they did feel that it was very important in that time, John Adams, John Hancock, many others among them, to create a place where people could gather to pursue knowledge. Now, it's important to remember, as I always remind myself, that at that time there were very few colleges and universities, and the current university system as we know it hadn't been developed yet. And so they really wanted the people who were pursuing knowledge in various ways at the colleges that were present at the time and outside of that, who were public leaders, who were thought leaders in the broadest possible sense, to come together and simply share ideas. And also to remember that America was understood as yet to be discovered by our founders, and that in both positive and sometimes negative aspects was also part of their understanding. They wanted to know the soil, the different soils of America. They wanted, the next thing after they founded themselves was they wanted to know the botanical names, as many as they could, and then new species and so on. So their founding mission was to gather every art and science so as to enhance the interest, honor, and dignity of a free, independent, and virtuous people. Right. And I love saying that. So it's, again, you have to say it again, but to gather every art and science so as to enhance the interest, honor, and dignity of a free, independent, and virtuous people.
And that is the people who were not yet free. aspiring
Right.
to this.
That is exactly right. And I can certainly talk about that in a second as well. So what really astounds me whenever I think about this is that the academy began simply by saying we've got to gather and we've got to pursue knowledge in all of its levels. Then the arts were really understood more in the Greek sense of ars technica, the technological knowledge, not in the sense that we know it today, but rather mechanical arts, agricultural arts, and so on. And in addition, the sciences were a lot known the way we would know it today, but they were also understood as deeply interconnected, much more than they are today because of our departments and discipline system. And they also, in the Enlightenment, still had a grounding in literature and theology, and not as much as it certainly was in the earlier centuries, but still very much connected. So you had a slightly different understanding of how knowledge was divided out with our founders, but you also had a really very profound Enlightenment understanding of the unity of knowledge, or at least the connectedness of knowledge. And it was not a big thing to be uh, doing statistics at night and theology in the morning, or reading literature in Greek and feeling like the best way to figure out that literature was to make architectural designs, in the afternoon. So I think that was the most important moment for the academy, was really that founding moment. John Adams later, several decades later, wrote to several of his compatriots in the academy and said, this is a paraphrase, some of my best memories and deepest moments of delight were sharing ideas with you all. So I think that's a very profound testimony to what the academy was even then. Since then, we have grown in a number of different ways, and we've had some really difficult moments too. We have had different homes in different parts of Boston. The academy was very Boston-centric for a long time. It grew. It did have foreign members from the beginning. Lafayette, a wonderful foreign member from the beginning. But it really didn't expand into the 5,200 member, 5 different areas of honoring people of excellence that we honor today, until really after World War II. And in World War II, there was this real movement. The President Mumford, cultural critic, very powerful person, said, the universities are taking over what we did, right? They are, getting together and sharing knowledge, or university associations or university departments. We need to be interdisciplinary. And we need to be interdisciplinary in a way that promotes research on the common good, whatever that looks like. So we have always been both a honorary society that honors excellence. We induct about between 230 and 250 folk a year. And we also are now a research institution for the common good. But the key thing that we do is do interdisciplinary research. And the way I talk about it is, whenever we think about a project, is it cross-sector or cross-disciplinary? Does it have to involve multiple points of view? That's number one. Number two, is it non-duplicative? Does it not duplicate stuff that other people are doing? And 3, is it good for the nation? Is it a way of producing synthetic knowledge that's interdisciplinary that people really need? People really need. And we've had a number of different moments of that, even before that ethos developed. We were a part of a great debate between Gray and Agassiz about evolution. We were the site of Alexander Graham Bell's demonstration of the telephone. We were the people that developed the idea of the nuclear midnight, where the clock gets closer and closer, or farther away, depending on what our state of nuclear affairs is internationally. So there are a lot of different moments when the Academy contributed through debate, I might add, which I know is the spirit of your work today, as well as through demonstration, as well as through just plain old thought recommendation, here's where we go. Something important to both American and international culture. And I also really deeply believe that even if there isn't a product, although I'm focusing a lot on new kinds of products for the Academy, just the fact that we get together with people really matters. And that has mattered deeply for the history of the United States. And I'm happy to talk more about why that matters. I could go on and on. I've just read a new draft of the new history of the Academy, so I'm going to be super nerdly unless you stop me. So I will stop there.
I would actually love to hear you expound on why that's been important since the beginning of the Academy. Being with people who aren't like you, who are cross-disciplinary and then different than you, coming at problems from different directions.
Oh, why that matters. Yeah. So I think on the East Coast, it's called a wicked problem. On the West Coast, it's called a gnarly problem. And I don't know what the Midwest thinks, or the Southwest or the Southeast. And so it's very important just to know that there are probably different words in different parts of American culture for what this is. There are some problems, I think, that, and it's not just problems, but issues and ways of being that are so deep and pervasive and multiple that the only way actually to get at them is to think in multiple ways. And I think there are so many different examples of that that we see today. Certainly the state of our public life is one. You could think about the ways in which our climate is changing, however you want to think about the source of that. That's an important conversation. There's another that I think is super interesting that I talk about all the time, which is the AIDS epidemic was addressed with 3 or 4 different medical approaches. I just interviewed Anthony Fauci for an award that we gave him. And he talks about the fact that there were always 3 or 4 different approaches that made the difference between actually AIDS being a death sentence and AIDS being survivable. And I love that example because, in my view, the most effective thing is always 3 or 4 things coming together. And I think that in the urgency of creating a nation, our founders knew that. They had to bring people together. The example that I like to give is, how we think about the Declaration of Independence. It began with multiple states realizing that if they actually became independent, they would need their own state constitutions, and everyone started to write them. And then over time, they realized that the preamble was necessary, and they kind of liked the preamble, and the preamble became the thing. That was a multiple project, a multiply pronged project from the beginning. And I think it's super important that we think about that kind of work all the time. In other words, not a silver bullet. It's so easy to think about a silver bullet. And I think it's a kind of magical thinking. It's magical, it is, they might say. But the harder work that I think is the work of democracy is saying, okay, what are the 3 or 4 conditions that I have to keep in my head to make this solution possible? And that's super hard sometimes. But I do think that's part of the American spirit. It's part of American pragmatism.
Steve, you're writing, so I feel sure that you have something to say.
What a joy to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for being part of this. It's just such an honor. So let's jump, if you don't mind, right into the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
No, which I think is, as many people know, I'm sort of a Lincoln guy, and Lincoln did not. He pegged the beginning of the country at the Declaration, not at the Constitution. He was everything to him. He said, all of my views of life come from the Declaration. The Declaration was fundamentally a consensus document, right? It was written not by Thomas Jefferson, but by Jefferson and a committee of 5, and then edited by the entire Continental Congress. So you're making a claim here for this multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, pluralistic view of life, that democracy requires all of these different, disparate voices, to our, into how we govern ourselves. That's not what people think anymore. Mm-hmm. And so how do you, with the Academy, through this incredible organization founded in 1780, how can you help us kind of regain this multidisciplinary approach, this humble, and maybe you would speak to that, this humble approach to how we govern ourselves?
I love that question. And I would only add, just in the spirit of humility, there's a saying in the early Jewish writing that is, you speak to one as if you speak to 100, and you speak to 100 as if you speak to one, which means that there's a number of different ways you can interpret that. But like that, if you go in to a lecture, thinking that you're going to lecture to 100 people and there's one person, that person is you treat with the same dignity as if it was a hall full of people. And if you go in and you expected one person and it's a hall full of people, and you were surprised with that, you still speak to them as if there was only one person sitting in the room. The reason why I mention that now is to know the humility here, that I think it's really important that my approach or the way I'm thinking about the Academy these days is very much based on the idea that we can be an example and we can be a place that people turn to, like the person who's speaking to one, but may happen to be speaking to 100. So I want to make sure that whatever we do can be set up as an example rather than necessarily the thing that changes everything, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about how people have perceived the Academy in the past and how we need to change our own practices to be much more understood as open and engaging and so forth. I can certainly talk about that too. So we have 5 different areas of focus in which we look at interdisciplinary problems and interdisciplinary solutions. The first is American institutions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The second is education. The third is security studies and international studies. The fourth is on science, engineering, and technology. And the fifth is on humanities, arts, and culture. And depending on which area you speak about, we will work on issues of the day and bring in both members who have been elected, best minds of the country, as well as folks who are could easily be Academy members, who are experts in the field, to work on particular issues. And we really identify those issues, again, by the criteria that I mentioned. Does it need a cross-disciplinary response, series of solutions? Is it something that is not being done by anyone else, and is it good for the nation? An example that I'll give you from another area, and then I'll get to American institutions, because I know, Steve, that's a big interest for you, is we have a commission going now on opportunities after high school. And the way we're talking about that is not higher ed, right, which is got a whole set of connotations to it. But how do people think about what they do after high school? And we're going to be recommending a number of different things in that space that are the other piece of it. Our values are focused on the power of deliberative discourse, the power of nonpartisanship. Frequently that's bipartisanship, but often it's nonpartisanship. We try to get multiple voices in the room. And the power of evidence and reasoning. All of those things people are committed to before they even come. So in our Commission on Opportunities After High School, we're looking at recommending things like a more powerful network between curricular designers and faculty and post-secondary education and employers and administrators and community members to create multiple ways of thinking so that the idea of a college dropout isn't the sort of failure of all or nothing, but rather, hey, what are you doing? There's a number of different things. And that brings in community colleges in a completely different way, because I deeply believe they have so much to contribute at this moment in our education system. So that's one example of what that looks like on the ground. Why does that matter for democracy in terms of, what are, to your question, how our founding fathers think about things, and mothers think about things, but how we sort of haven't lived up to our own vision of ourselves. The way I would put it is we have Democratic and Republican leaders in that commission. There was one day I was so moved because I've only had like 2 or 3 times. I'm sure everyone on this call or, listening to this will think about the moments when you don't even know why you're moved, but you're moved. I had one my second month at the academy, and I was watching a lifelong Democrat committed to really important issues of diversity, and a lifelong Republican who was in charge of of education policy more broadly in a red state, just talking to each other about what access to post-secondary education meant. And they were trying to wordsmith. They were doing that work that the Declaration did, to your point. And I'm sitting there, I'm watching them go back and forth. And I'm sitting there going, why am I verklempt, right? Why am I getting so moved? And I realized it's because they were doing the work that every American should be doing with somebody, right? And they were doing it with respect because they knew each other. They hung out. They stayed at the table, which is the number one formula. They stayed at the table. And they did it with the 2 words that I think of that I think should be part of American culture are forbearance and fortitude. And they completely disagreed at a certain level. And yet what they stayed in is we both care about access and we both care about fairness. I'm like, okay, let's begin there. This as a mediator all the time, right? You just state the basics and see if you can stay in the basics for a little while. And they were finding a way to say something about access in higher education that was bipartisan and deeply plural at the same time. And I was just, sort of really stunned by this at a certain level. And it was like everyone's worst nightmare, writing by committee. And there I was getting teary. It's like, wow, bureaucratic processes must excite you. You must really need a life. But nonetheless, so that would be an example to answer your question. I want to just spend some time because I know the Village Square is really interested in American institutions on what we've done in this space. The first is something that is called Habits of Heart and Mind. We just came out with it in December, which is a series of recommendations, blueprint for action on how to build civic culture. Again, bipartisan set of recommendations. Second is we're about to come out with a set of recommendations on proportional representation. And that's a really exciting new project. Third is we are really working on local democracy and bringing together people who work in context of local democracy to share what they have learned in thinking in new contexts about what democracy looks like in Arizona, in California, and so on. And then we also are about to come out with a report on how to, on a blueprint for action, more than a report on how to build citizenship in higher education. And again, how to is not quite the right phrase. It's just here's the thinking of some cool people from across a number of different perspectives. And this is what we suggest. And so again, back to the humility thing, to really be clear that this is a moment in time, a set of recommendations that usually takes at least 1, 2, 3 years. And that's the other piece of it that's so hard right now for us, to your point, is that democracy takes so much time. And that, deliberative work, deliberative conversations take time. And that is something that is really hard for folks right now because we're feeling like we want to heal it. It's been a long time now, and we haven't healed it yet. So I think that Americans in general are feeling that urgency. All of the things that I just mentioned are part of something called Our Common Purpose, which was the title of this conversation. And that was a bipartisan set of recommendations, over 30, on renewing democracy, particularly constitutional democracy, because again, it was, I wasn't there, but the folks who were leading it and the folks who were in it, the commissioners felt that they couldn't agree on definitions of democracy. Good. Hang in there. Keep talking. The compromise they came up with, or the phrase they came up with, was constitutional democracy. Then people could get together. So that's what they used. So all of these are the most recent things I just mentioned are outcomes of the things that were recommended in Our Common Purpose. And I was busy being a college president when I first came across Our Common Purpose, and I said, please order me at 100. I'm putting them in every classroom. Please read. And you can do, the shorter version and the longer version and so on. So that's what I'm really proud of in our American institutions. We're doing a lot more. But the other thing I will say is, as I have become president, there are several different things that we're looking at for new directions or very old directions. The two I would call your attention to, the first is everything that we do in our 5 program areas that I mentioned are going to be about cultivating democracy and strengthening democracy. And that's going to look different in each one of them. In the science, it's going to look different than in arts and culture and so on. And then the second thing is we're really trying to learn from the power of the local. And again, this is why the Village Square and its related organizations' work is so important, which is I deeply believe that America can recognize itself and heal itself at the local level. I think it is where there is a robust and dutiful set of relations that remain part of our fabric and our experience, not only of everyday life, but of the public square. I think we can learn how to be brave in the public square at the local level still, and it's super scary. It's scarier than ever to be in that public square. And I think that we can still learn those skills at the local level. And I think we can really address some issues. One of the reasons why we had, when I was president of Middlebury, so many internships in Addison County, and Middlebury will be the first place to be entirely powered by renewable energy. And 4 years, student-led, because they could think at the county level. They didn't feel so overwhelmed that they despaired. They said, okay, we can at least do this. And that was huge enough. But yes, it can be huge, but it also needs to be manageable and thinkable. And so I'm really hoping for the Academy to launch a number of different initiatives. We've got a couple going now on the power of the local. One, we're looking at the role of what we call anchor institutions. Those are universities, faith-based organizations, and hospitals to help solve America's housing crisis. How we can use our land differently, how we can support that in new ways. And secondly, we're also thinking about developing a program of partners with local experts who do not have national pedigrees, but whose knowledge, librarians, teachers, historians, self-taught historians, whose knowledge has contributed to the public good. And I hope to permanently connect the Academy to America's communities that way. So those are a couple examples of the power of the local. And the final one I'll add is bringing together community colleges in Boston to look at new forms of curricular design that are really working. And it's just an honor to be able to bring those places together. So at the local solution level.
So that has absolutely been our experience these last 2 decades that we've been doing this work at the local level while the national civic fabric has been fraying more desperately. And in fact, in some ways, it's actually been kind of frustrating. We were I think that if you just talk to people in your community, we think we figured some stuff out here while it's just accelerating and getting worse and worse. So, for us, you all leading this kind of initiative has been really transformational because it's not us just sort of saying, "Hey, look at us." Um, and I do want to do a little show and tell with our audience before we leave, or maybe we probably won't really leave the historic part of this conversation. But I've had the fortune to be able to be in the building that Laurie is in. And the frames you see on the back, they start at the door, and they are acceptances for nominations to the Academy. And John Adams and Samuel Adams and what is it? It was 60 some odd people at the time, Laurie, that did the invitations. So among their first invitations were George Washington. And the next one I got is Thomas Jefferson. And these are they're copies of the letters, but in their hand. Isn't that extraordinary? Charles Darwin. There's so many more, too, that I didn't. Albert Einstein. And then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this one I particularly love because he both accepts the honor and he says that the application fee is being mailed under separate cover. They're both transcendent and also a little bit mundane. It is an extraordinary. It just keeps going, right? The letters keep going. You feel the DNA of our lives together as a people through those letters. You feel it.
Yes, I love them. They are behind me, and I always bring people to those letters because there's always someone, right, that speaks to someone. And, when you think of Marian Anderson, she actually hung out and taught music in her hometown her whole life. And, they're that example of sort of someone who's powerfully national and yet at the same time deeply local. There's a great story that just happened, with a guest who was an expert in German literary history. And she looked at Einstein's acceptance letter and she got teary and she said there's a specific reason for that, which is I certainly have never noticed the addresses, but his address is Haberlandstrasse, which is where he used to live. And he was apparently renowned, she said, the German literary historian, for going out in his PJs and his slippers to get coffee in the little cafe across the street and then coming back. And that was what everyone knew about Haberlandstrasse and Einstein. That was like the thing that everyone knew. During the World War II, the Nazis actually took that name off because it was understood as a Jewish name. And so it ceased to become that. And as part of the German reconciliation process of German citizens to their own history, they restored the name Haberlandstrasse. So she was just imagining him. He probably, before he wrote that letter, had just gone out across the street to get the little coffee and the croissant at Haberlandstrasse, which I just loved as, like that's a thing. But I think it's also, it's important for us to carry both the pride and, the way that we fell short. There are moments in the Academy's history that are tough. There are times when we became very inward, and we didn't really think about what was happening in the outside world in a way that many folks, including many members, think we should have. There are, Phyllis Wheatley, who is now what we call a legacy honoree, which is we have begun a practice of naming folks that we think could and should have been nominated to the Academy that were not, because I did not have access to that world. Phyllis Wheatley, the great African enslaved poet in the 18th century, one of them, people didn't believe that she was as brilliant as she was and could have created the verses that she did. And so they created a tribunal of leading intellectuals in Boston to put her, to test her essentially and put her on trial. And she passed with flying colors, but James Bowdoin was one of the members who interrogated her at that point. So they're just those kinds of stories that we should also embrace. But back to Steve's point, what it means to be that history is the history of struggle and inspiration combined. And that's, I think, what we need to be committed to doing today as well. And that I think the local question and the ways to think about the stories of the local, to your point, Liz, and then elevate them to the national. We need to be activated networks of local stories. And that's something that I hope we can contribute to.
I have another question. Can I ask it?
Yes, you go.
So, doctor, so we think about the founders as like beacons for freedom, and we talk a lot about liberty. But I've been pondering, and I know you've been pondering, the question of what we owe each other as citizens of a democratic republic. What is it that what is it that we owe each other, and how does the academy kind of grapple with those responsibilities of citizenship?
It's a really profound question. What do we owe each other as citizens, I think, is something that has evolved over time, but there's been a kind of steady constant. And that is, in my view, can we hold on to the relationship in the midst of the difference? Can we be aware and be committed to cultivating a relationship in the midst of the difference? And that's a very, very hard thing to do, especially when the differences become what Amanda Ripley calls high conflict, where your identity is more invested in being in the conflict and being a participant in the conflict than it is in resolving the conflict. And that's a super tough way of being in the world. And yet, the more that is cultivated, the harder it is. That would be the first thing. And the second thing, we have, when you talk about freedom, there's a lot of conversation about rights. And the way I put it is that it always needs to be rights and responsibilities. Or freedom and responsibility would be another way to put it. And that's a hard thing too, because that's a both and it's a very, I frequently say, and Steve and Liz, I wonder if you would agree, the radical place to be these days is not in the extremes. The radical place to be often is in the middle, because you're either infuriating because everyone says, oh, you're not being strong enough, or you are literally illegible. You can't be heard because people don't understand what you're saying by the both and. But I think the interesting thing about both rights and responsibilities, which is what we owe each other as citizens, is, or freedom and responsibility, is those prepositions afterwards. You have to think about all kinds of freedom: the freedom to, the freedom for, and the freedom from. And I think you also need to think about the responsibility to and the responsibility for. And that's a lot. That's 5 prepositions in 2 words, right? But I just think it's so profoundly important for us to think about that as we begin to try to weave a social fabric together that looks different. So here's an example that I think about all the time in Salem Village. I'm super interested in post-conflict. What do people do after everything has gone to heck in a hay basket, right? And then they have to rebuild. And Salem Village had that. It was this tiny town next to Salem City. People were accused. People were put to death. People lost their family members. And it was a small community. Both city and country were small communities. And when I ask folks, does anyone know what happened after all that? We know that, Mather was obsessed with, whether he did the right thing, how was it all going to work. In his later writings, we know that people got on with the work of being those towns and cities. There was a guy named Joseph Green who succeeded Reverend Paris, who was part of the fomenter of a lot of the accusations. And Joseph Green, there was no such thing as conflict mediation, your field, my avocation. And he had all the instincts. He was the parishioner in which the accusers and the family of the people who'd been put to death had to go to church in the same pews, and it wasn't a big church. And he rearranged the seating. And he worked with, so everyone had to sit near someone who they had to humanize because they literally had to sit next to them. And he also worked one-on-one with every single person. One of the accusers, Abigail, made a full apology in the church only after he had worked with her. And no one knows this guy. As you said, who is Joseph Green? If you said, who is titular Reverend Paris, some people might know. Joseph Green is the guy who did that work. The reason why I mention him is because he had a real sense of what we owed each other, right? And I think particularly in post-conflict situations, whether it's America or somewhere else, but particularly in America, and it was local, he knew that freedom from, particularly the freedom from in a post-conflict, and freedom to were super important, as was responsibility for and to. And so that would be my answer right now. And I should make it clear, I'm heading this amazing organization because I'm super interested in the role of the scholar in society and how people who know things are connected to other people who know things. And whether we can simply see that on a spectrum in America rather than feel like there's an elite and a non-elite. But I'm not an expert in democracy. I'm an experiencer and lover of democracy. So I can and I think about the public square. But my experience of what we owe each other, it does not come from quote unquote expertise. It comes from a lived reality from childhood onwards that our history is about those spectacular failures and then healing. As de Tocqueville says, we know Americans know how to heal each other, or heal from their mistakes, as you said in our previous conversation.
I think I'm going to make some Joseph Green T-shirts. What do you think?
And there's a little monument to the person who's by virtue of his spirit, I can't remember how they put it. It was like very 1910 sort of language, but I think someone rediscovered him and realized that we owe him. The good news is he was the kind of guy who clearly wouldn't have cared whether he had a monument or not, and that's a good thing too.
So I wanted to point out that we put both the link to our Common Purpose report and Habits of Heart and Mind, which is Tocqueville, in the chat. And I just wanted to, with everything I've got, if you have not read these reports, they are thorough, thoughtful, wise, just really, really important. And they have very specific actions that they're recommending. So before we talk, and we got a lot of questions, and in some ways, a lot of the questions just said, oh my gosh, what do we do? It was different variations of what do we do? So before we get to that part, is there anything about the current challenging civic environment we're in that's just really important to understand, that you want to elevate in this conversation before we move on to what do we do?
Yeah, I think, and I can talk about this at the end of our conversation too, but I think that there is an understanding of how we are different from each other that we need to elevate more. I've written about this in an article. It's called Pragmatic Pluralism. And basically the idea, it's partly the sort of American pragmatic tradition, Dewey and, many, many other folk. But it's a way of thinking about difference. If you come to an interreligious dialogue, and here I've studied and thought about these questions more than I've thought about other kinds of questions, and say, I tolerate you, rather than, hey, I'm for religious tolerance, but then you turn it into a verb with an object. I tolerate you. It doesn't sound great. Although right now we would be happy with that too, right? Like, let's be clear.
That would be progress.
That's right. That would be progress. But I think we also need, we talk about celebrating difference. We talk about tolerating difference. We talk about understanding difference. We talk about studying our differences. But we don't talk about needing our differences. And there are many forms of human relationship that help us thrive or help species thrive that allow for difference and actually require it. So if you look at relationships of trade, for example, and you have I have apples and you have oranges, and I suddenly, go into the orange market, we're going to have a very different relationship than if we have a relationship where we have different things that we both need that we can trade and we can use for difference. It's an obvious example, but that's one of the reasons why barter cultures are so interesting. And then and another would be biodiversity, right? That it's actually those kinds of ecosystems that thrive the most because of their difference. They need difference. So what would it look like at the local level for us to say, I actually am a Democrat and I need Republicans. I'm a Republican and I need Democrats. And I would say that is true for me. I always need people to think differently than I do because I got to check my own thinking. That's a hard thing to do often, but I wonder what it would look like to not just dialogue across difference, but actually need it. And that would be, I think, the most important thing to think about as a frame. And there are extraordinary stories in religious difference because that really shape this and cultivate this in interesting ways. And they are American stories. So one of the books that I hope I finish is about this question. And there are moments in 4 different arenas that I have found in American life where we do this work across religious difference. They are the context of mourning, i.e. mourning losses, context of sharing buildings and the guardianship of buildings, context of food and food preparation, and context of art and artistic expression. So, for example, an international example is the holder of the keys to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the most powerful Christian monument, is a Muslim. And he's been for 800 years because Christians know that if any single group held the keys to that most powerful shrine, you would have a problem, right? Immediately. And so that they need that outsider, they need that difference. You see that in a number of different contexts in the United States. The highest level of interfaith engagement is in food pantries in the United States. That's not a surprise to me that the yoga person and, the Orthodox Jewish person and the Christian evangelical person are all going to show up to make those sandwiches. So there are a number of different stories I could share of American inspirations in that space. But part of that is that they create episodic relationships. They create lasting relationships that are durable, rather than relationships that are momentary. And I think that is a crucial piece of what we need to think about as we think about living with difference.
So, Steve, anything that you want to ask about before we turn to what some of the prescriptions are, and also questions from the audience, and please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom.
I do, Doctor. Just one last one, and you and I talked about this in our preliminary comments, and what you just said was so powerful. But you and I both realized that in the last couple of weeks we had both read Hannah Arendt, and we talked about that in our preparation. And what struck me when I read her, and you and I talked about it, was her more than intuition, her realization that the face of evil, really, really bad stuff, came from thoughtlessness, thoughtlessness or a lack of knowledge is kind of where you started this whole conversation. And then, and this was her quote, an individual's almost total inability ever to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view. And this isn't mushy. You know, often when many of us say we've got to try to walk in another person's shoes, we've got to try to understand their perspective, that whole Florida Humanities is part of our sponsorship here, the whole concept of the humanities, helping us to understand each other, is not just nice. It's survival.
Right.
In a democracy, right? And I think that's what you've been saying. And
Yeah.
it's a point, and maybe you could riff on that for just a moment, how critical this is to the future.
Yeah. And I think what Hannah Arendt was speaking about when she spoke about that, as well as the phrase that she's more famous for, the banality of evil, is about the fact that it's in everyday contexts that we begin to forget the humanity of the other person.
Right.
And that, I think, is where I'm really focused, and why we just discovered how weird it was that we're both reading something about the Eichmann trial and something about what Hannah Arendt said about it. Clearly we were meant to have this conversation, but what really struck me is, you know, the banality. Some people criticize Arendt for saying that the banality of that Eichmann wasn't just following orders and doing what he was told, that he really did have this passionate hatred for the other, and all of the people that were put in concentration camps. And yes, the way I would put it is that he knew that even if he did have that, he knew that saying, I was just following orders, I was just doing my everyday job, would be a kind of persuasion. And he'd hoped it would work, because there is a level at which that everyday little bit ends up creating a cumulative dehumanization. And that, I think, is what's so powerful. And this is something related, Liz, to what you were saying earlier. And this is part of the reason why we convene all the time in the Academy in person as much as we can. And that convening is its own healing, you know, at a certain level, is that you need to find a space in a democracy for a place other than the place of debate. There needs to be another context in which we hang out. So many different groups. Interfaith America does this. I talk about this in Pragmatic Pluralism, the articles I've written on this, and in the book that I hope will be finished one day. And that is, if friendship is your context, and that is the rock solid space, you are going to be able to endure disagreement in a different way. That's an obvious truth, but then back to responsibilities and freedoms. Your responsibility is to cultivate that friendship in other contexts, right? I was part of this is an American story about Pragmatic Pluralism, a group of Muslim and Jewish women. Something had blown up in the Middle East in the early 2000s between Israel and Palestine, and they couldn't talk because it was so horrible. We're living through that now. And they were they gathered for meals. And so they decided, okay, talking is the problem. So we're going to meet in silence. We're going to continue to meet because we are responsibility for that friendship. And we're going to cook and meet in silence. And that's what they did the whole time. And so that was their way of thinking, what am I responsible for, as a way of continuing that. And I had a very funny thing. I was thinking about how to bring this to the moment. Yesterday, I was coming back from the airport. I had an Uber driver who didn't speak English very well. And he was parked in the wrong place outside my building in Boston. And someone came up behind him and started yelling at him and being abusive. And I tried to get him to move, and he didn't understand what I was saying. And so the guy got more abusive. And there's nothing that makes me more crazy than that kind of thing. And I get it, because he wanted to move. He wanted to go in his parking place. I don't know what his reality was. He was in a hurry. So that's a space of debate. Parking lots are frequently space of debate. It was America at its worst right now. It was uncivil and so on. I said, as I got out, I said to the Uber driver, I'm really sorry that happened. I'm really sorry he spoke to you that way. And again, it was hard because of the language. So I'm going in the building and I'm like, I got to run because I do not want to deal with this guy. This guy was such a jerk. I do not want to deal with this guy. And of course, the universe gives me my own medicine, right? Which is find another place for the debate because he and I live in the same building and cultivate another place. So the elevator opens and there he is. I'm like, okay, the universe is giving me the other place for friendship. So we're sitting there driving up. I said, were you the guy that yelled at the Uber guy? And he said, yeah, I was. That guy did blah, 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 as if I would join him in how stupid he was. And I said, there was a language problem and he didn't understand what I was saying. And I said, and he was really upset by what you said. And there were maybe 5 more floors, so we didn't have a lot to say in response. I had to get out. We moved on. But I thought, there is the universe giving me an opportunity to create another kind of relationship with this person who I felt had behaved so badly, right? So that's a very silly but recent example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Find another place to cultivate another kind of relationship with the same people that you cannot abide in debate or where you have the most heated debate.
Yeah. So wonderful segue into moving into what you do about this. So one of the things that you've talked about already and that your reports focus on is how important it is that this isn't something that we're going to be able to take care of at a national digital level. It's got to be. Actually, I'm gonna read a quote from the talk that you gave when I first had the pleasure to meet you. What is a union? It's a pre-commitment for us to live together, even if we don't like each other. This pre-commitment can't be instilled from top down. It has to be rerouted. It has to be rehumanized in place.
Yeah, I love that. And do you, Steve? You want to add? I don't want to.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Better.
So thinking about, I think you're right, Liz. That or what you just read, I agree with myself from 11 months ago. But I think about it as rehumanizing, that there's a discipline for us in rehumanizing that takes time. And the way I would put it, just to be really direct, is take the 7 things in fortifying civic culture, go to choose your town, choose your county, choose your space, whatever it is, town or county, could be city, could be zip code, whatever it is, and sit down and write an answer to how you practically will do every single one of those things. So, and bring a group together. So what does it mean to practice civic love and joy? Have those moments of celebration in your town, in your space. What does it mean to promote habits of service? What's not happening that is a habit of service that you could create? What does it mean to create a space for the free exchange of ideas and model being unafraid? Who's afraid right now in your community and why? Could be anybody. Mm-hmm. And talk about what it means for them to be slightly less afraid. Sometimes, as deliberative dialogue talks about, in a scaffolded conversation where you keep the goals of the conversation super simple and really, really basic for a while, just to build trust, is what does it mean for us to spend 3 months together, meet once a week, and say one brave thing? And that's it. Whatever that might look like. Engage people in co-design and decision-making. Where are the decisions being made in your zip code, whatever it might be, that are not as inclusive as you might want them to be? Whatever that looks like. Practice mutualism and mutual aid. Where is there a mutual exchange of goods? Whatever they could be, intellectual goods, they could be actual goods, they could be whatever it is. What does that mutual aid look like? And where could we start it? Spread narratives of common purpose. I think that's super hard right now, but what would it look like to get together wherever you are and talk about what a common purpose is? Why are we all in this county? What matters in this county to all of us? And then that root activity in shared place. Where are the places within your place that everyone loves and why, and have those kinds of conversations. So I would say find an answer and an activity to those 7 things in your community. And I am not in any way a prophet, nor am I a reader of the future, but I do know that if those kinds of things are done, you will feel more empowered, you will feel more connected, and you will feel more rooted. And I think that alone is a way to begin to heal your immediate environment. So I'm trying to be super direct because I know people are like, what do I do? Take the 7 things and do one thing in relationship to the 7 things. And find a group that wants to do it, but make sure they are really different. Make sure they are cross-ideological, they are cross-racial, they are cross-ethnic, they are cross-religious, etc. And have super low expectations and lots of joy. That's a good combination.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Actually, you answered our first question, which is how can groups with seemingly opposing purposes be led to compromise? And the main thing is that you start not really expecting that you're going to get anywhere and let the relationship take over.
Right, and go bowling together or do something that has nothing to do with any of your disagreement and commit to that at the same time. And that, I think, really does make a difference because you are the story that I mentioned to you before, it plays out in so many different ways. That the food story where, okay, we're going to cook, we're not going to talk, we're going to cook. Interreligious dialogue between Syrian refugees in a rural town in California. It's going fine, but it's not great. And, you can talk about Christian ideas and you can talk about Muslim ideas. That works for a while. But when I asked the person who was leading the dialogue, well, what do you think would enliven? He said, I have no idea. And I said, what do they do? And they said, well, most of them are farmers. I said, you're in a rural county. He said, yeah, they've got some really interesting ideas about irrigation. And I said, great, make the whole conversation the next time about irrigation and see what happens. And he came back and his face was on a glow. He said, wow, it was so much more fun. And we exchanged much more different idea. Like, what do you do when it doesn't rain? Well, what's your prayer when it doesn't rain? Oh my God. And this is what we can do for irrigation. And so that's that space of joy. And you'll find it, people will find it in their communities as well.
So one of the things that we found, and that really is one of the basic principles that we've gone by all these years, and it really does work. But human beings have, we are very groupish. We have a deep tendency to do the us and them thing. It's part of our nature. But we also have this amazing capacity to reciprocate kindness. I think it's a human superpower. And if we're in proximity with people, no matter who they are, it starts happening and you start seeing it and you realize that it's starting to turn things around. My husband has a friend that he goes out with who they disagree on all politics, but they reached out to each other years ago and they spend hours sometimes at lunch together because they have a real relationship, and that real relationship is okay with the differences.
I think that's right. I think the hardest one right now that I should have mentioned in the beginning is cross-class conversation in an age of extraordinary wealth inequality. And that commitment is super important. My family has a cabin on a place in Barters Island in Maine. And Barters Island, a while back, 3 decades ago, realized that it was going to be the 10 square mile petri dish of the biggest wealth inequality in America as wealthy folks started to come in. And they realized the only thing they should do is community association, and that they had to have a community association that just met every month. Silly, straightforward, but that community association prevents the island from becoming this, place of seething resentment that, blows up at the local post office or whatever else it would be. And I think that's another important thing. I think it's better not to think about reconciliation. I think it's better to think about simply modus vivendi, living together. That's it. Because that, I think, will, again, change the expectations and keep them lower. as much as possible. And I think that's a super important principle to hold in mind as we move forward. And it's also about shared place. Like, you may have massive class difference, and we need to fix that. We need to think about that. And we need to share this place. And how do we share that place? And I think I know the Village Square has worked on place-based knowledge in interesting ways too. And I think that's that final recommendation, I think, really creates the depth to friendships like your husband and his political disagreeer in ways that they probably are like super attached to the breakfast place or wherever that they go, or the pancakes, whatever that. And that is non-trivial. Yeah, I think that's part of what we need to lift up. Another thing that I wanted to respond to earlier, something you said, Liz, and it's in the spirit of some of the things that Steve has been asking, and that is, it feels so totalizing right now. And Steve used the word survival, that, that understanding of the other is about survival in a democracy. I would say it's the way I would put it is, we were talking about Hannah Arendt earlier. There's a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, that talks about radical hospitality, and that the only way we can actually encounter the other is by being completely open to the humanity of that person and almost giving up ourselves. And a friend of mine who studies Levinas says that when you are in that kind of human encounter, and you are aware of a history that you yourself have been part of that is violent, then that also means that you encounter someone with a face that says, "Do not kill me." That's how powerful it is, that you are in that space, not just a mutual embrace, etc., but we know what this could look like if we don't have the discipline to open to that kind of encounter. And I thought it was very harsh, but also very powerful. And I think it's a harsh way of thinking about our reality today and what is necessary.
So here's a question. How do we overcome the anonymous nature and hate that social media tends to spread?
Yeah. I want to try and respond directly, but it's not as if I have an answer, that I think the way I would put it is just that, there are some things that I've thought about. The first is that resist the algorithm, right? The more we can be aware of how subject we are to algorithms, the better off we will be to reclaim our attention. Because attention, in my view, and Simone Weil speaks about this in beautiful ways too, is the beginning of humanity, right? There's a beautiful book, I think, by Chris Hayes called The Siren's Call, which is a next level of contemplation of what has been called the economy of attention. And the economy of attention, as he puts it, is attention is finite, and yet it is therefore, because it is finite, in order to monetize it, which is what happens on social media and where we are with our online lives now, it has to be split into further and further, finer and finer bites. And he calls any agenda for a meeting, he calls any way of being in the world, in the public space, a regime of attention, which I think is a super powerful way of thinking about it. And he goes back to Steve's favorite person at the Lincoln Douglas debates. That was crowds with hundreds of people packed in a room, no microphone, and 3 hours of debate in which people were going back and forth. And, Lincoln and Douglas were going, here's, my opponent's point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like opening 6 parentheses and then closing them. And the crowd listening. And they were all policy things, that was just, if we would not have the attention for that today in quite the same way. But he said that was a different regime of attention where our minds were organized differently. It was also in person. And so it's not that we need to go back to that. We couldn't, I don't think. But to be super aware that because the algorithms of online work shift our attention so quickly. And because it's about attention, the conspiracy theory will always get more attention than the reasoned argument, period. It's one of the reasons why conspiracy theories are as much as regnant and as powerful as they are today. That, I think, is a super powerful thing to think about in terms of social media, which is the discipline of rehumanization that I was talking about earlier seems to me to begin with redisciplining our attention. And when I say discipline, it sounds kind of harsh. I don't mean it that way. I simply mean that there's a method to doing so. And that means commit yourself to in-person meetings as much as you can. Commit yourself to moving away from the algorithm when we know it. We know it when we're online and we see it. Stop it right away. And also, there are a number of different new societies and organizations, and Liz, you probably know many of them, that talk about what it means to have an online life that is about building community. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing for us to begin to think about. I have a friend who only meets online with people that she knows she's going to see in person, right? Which is a new way of thinking about, what online community is. It's only to develop the human in-person, face-to-face relationship, right? And we've been talking about the fact that in-person means that there are rules of engagement that look completely different than online. And we all know this in our bones. It's become an obvious fact of life for us. But what's less obvious is the habits that we have to develop to resist it. And that's the kind of way that I would put it. The way a lot of people think about AI these days is AI should only be used by humans for humans. What that looks like in your life is you're going to have to figure that out. But every day, think about, am I using technology, that dehumanizing technology that the wonderful questioner asked? Is it by humans and for humans? And what is the discipline that I'm going to adopt to rehumanize my life? Including meeting with Congress people, right? That's what we got to do. I got to go visit them in their office, right? I'm not going to just hang out and send them emails or make phone calls. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about as well.
Yeah, that's actually one of our questions is, what do we do about them? How do we get them to be less divisive? That's a big one.
Yeah, it's a huge one. First of all, I feel like I've been doing way too much talking. I love your thoughts on this, and then I will jump in because I want this to be more of a conversation in terms of what you guys think. How have you done this work, particularly in either the humanistic world or in the Village Square?
So I'm not sure that we've really tackled elected officials directly, except for that. I mean, so one of the things that we do locally is we have programming with our local elected officials so that people know them. So we have a program called Speed Date Your Local Leaders. And it's a way to, again, rehumanize people, right? So they're not just two-dimensional, they're actual people. We also have like an annual town hall. We've done that for 10 years. It's like what you're describing, which is it's a space that is now a tradition in our community. We know that every year we're going to have these kinds of programs. So for us, it's, we've invited elected leaders and they've done some programs with us. And, it's almost always surprising in the upside when you get to know people in more dimensions than two. And so, I mean, I would kind of argue that in some ways it seems, kind of jumping off of what both of you have said, it seems like it's, an overly simplistic formula, and yet is the correct one. That if you are only, re-inhabiting your life, touching some grass, being with people who don't look or think like you, that it's transformative. And if all of us picked up an end of that and started doing it now, Robert Putnam was a guest on this series, and he and Shailene Romney Garrett in their book, The Upswing, talk about how after World War I-ish, that they talk about it's like a flock of birds that move in unison, that something was happening and you couldn't exactly tell what it was. Well, it was a lot of citizens simply doing what it is we're talking about. Being close to home, doing something together about something that they cared about, keeping it pretty simple and relational. And, it changes everything.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's super hard to do it. So I would suggest that the next thing that's less simplistic and obvious is creating a set of examples of what it looks like to do that.
Yeah.
And sharing it and featuring it and getting the local newspaper to publish it. And, having a compendium, not just a website, but any number get the local library to feature it as part of its curriculum, et cetera. I think that's super important. I also think, again, to start at of course, you want to go to the state and level, or the national level, but I think working with your state legislators is incredibly important. One of the things that I learned in a very powerful way at Middlebury was when I first became president, people thought, Middlebury doesn't care about Vermont. All its graduates go elsewhere. And they weren't wrong. But I thought, okay, I've got to change this because I felt like Middlebury owed everything to Vermont. It became the town's college because it was in competition for federal funds about 20 years after the academy was founded with Burlington, and Burlington won, and UVM got created in the late 1790s. So Middlebury said, well, too bad. We're going to create our own university anyway, or our own college anyway. So it was called the town's college. So I thought, how can we be that and still be known to be sending our graduates, elsewhere? So I realized the only solution was to take literally 5 years and show up at everything you possibly could, at the state legislative breakfast, at, the work with the people who you knew. There was one state legislator that I profoundly disagreed with on a COVID policy. That was rough. And I said, no, I'm going to stay. I'm going to serve the person a drink. I'm going to just be in that space as much as I could. When you're the largest employer in a county, you are a public figure of a kind that you didn't even necessarily, ask for or plan to be. And I decided at one time that to have all the legislators over. And we just had a ball. They were all over for dinner, and they were all just, the neighborhood folk, really. And it was kind of hilarious because they wouldn't leave. I was going up to my little presidential apartment above the local dining hall, and it was like, 12 midnight, and they were still out there turning off the lights and everything. So this is a powerful, thing to think about in terms of the legislature. I also want to say that when our report comes out about expanding representation, we are making bipartisan recommendations about moving away from the current winner-take-all system with the multi-member congressional districts and proportional version of ranked choice voting. I'm not an expert in this, so I'm not going to be able to give you, the finer details, but please do look for that, because that's a bipartisan report that says, it's a way of saying at a systemic level, let's rehumanize our representation system, which we hope would help combat polarization and also increase voter turnout and eliminate as much of the gerrymandering as we can. So that's another very straightforward thing that I would say. I know someone wanted to ask about practices, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, we're running a little out of time, sadly. It always goes so fast. I wanted to give Steve a chance before I asked a last question to ask his last question.
Well, I think forbearance and fortitude, that is my new reason to live. I think that is really powerful at the beginning of all of this. And the only other thing, Doctor, I wanted to mention, you've said this several times during this presentation, but you talk about spontaneity and the power of convening and the magic that occurs when people of goodwill gather and sometimes not with a particular goal in mind, but just to listen to each other. And that's been a theme through this. And until you talked about it, I'm not sure I gave it as much credibility, but but what you say is so true. And that is where the openings occur for democracy to happen. And I really appreciate that perspective. It is not necessarily something that, is the stuff of which books are made and structures are established. It is people giving grace to each other to allow ourselves. In Lincoln's great word, he said the founders showed us the capability of a people to govern themselves, that we are capable of governing ourselves. And I just think that was really powerful. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of this wisdom tonight. This has been just magnificent.
Oh, I love talking to you guys. You're doing the work that it's just the envy of someone like me who's interested in how pragmatic pluralism works in the United States and continues to work. And it's been such a joy to be part of it. I do think that spontaneity matters. I think that part of what a meeting has become bureaucratized. Right. And when a nation was being formed, meeting was scary. Meeting was convening at all was also people had rivalries, people had sympathies, people had all these different things that got played out in that moment of meeting. And that's what I always love about the power of convening, is that it, at least at the time of our founders, it was an event in its own right. And that sense of spontaneity and that sense of excitement about the fact of meeting led to some incredibly creative thinking and powerful thinking. And that's why I always say that the beginning of democracy is in convening, and in persisting in convening, that is also democracy's persistence. And that is why I find it so powerful as a concept, even though we need to reinvent the word or maybe come up with a different word for it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to spend time with you all today and share what I love about a great American institution.
So it was sort of pulling together a bunch of the questions. There were a lot of questions about just sort of the exhaustion. How do you manage your way through this? How do you stay informed but keep your life going? And there was a specific one that we really liked, which is, do you have specific practices to start and end your day in order to feel ready for your day given the current political climate? And I'm going to combine that with just one of the things that the reports talk about is practicing civic love and joy. So I wanted to ask you if you could sort of draw us a picture on what it looks like when this is working well, what it looks like for you personally when you're sort of pacing yourself in this environment.
To answer very practically the first question, I have a practice. I study and teach ancient Indian religion. So I teach Buddhism and ancient Indian Hindu meditation and recitation practice, as well as think about religion in the public square. And so there's a great tradition of Vipassana meditation, which is called insight meditation from ancient India, that I practice every day in the morning and the evening. Sometimes I can only do 10 minutes each time. It's a lot of what has informed mindfulness-based stress reduction and so on. And it's just a simple practice of watching the breath. And the more simple it is, the better it is, because you are aware of being alive. You have to rehumanize yourself. And that's the hardest thing to do, is to figure out how to rehumanize yourself when you are in this environment and you're working on behalf of the public good. Super hard. That's number one. Second, I always ring a bell. I have a bell in my office whenever I feel like I've accomplished something, or my staff has, we ring a bell. And so people go, oh my God, there's the bell. Well, something must have happened. And it's not just about raising money the way they do in fundraisers and so forth. It's, wow, I got this done, whatever it might be. Don't ever set your Zoom, if you're doing that, to take out background noise, because you'll never be able to hear the bell. So I also ring the bell in morning and evening. And the third thing I do, they're all three really simple things based in my study of India, is gratitude, which is gratitude practice in the morning as well as in the evening. There's a Buddhist prayer that's very interesting that says, "May all beings without one exception be happy." And of course, what is your mind going to do? Your mind is going to go to that one exception, right? The person that really got you mad. It's
Yes,
sort of
it
like, nope,
does.
right? You have to wish them well too. And that's powerful. That's a powerful way of staying grounded. And there's a Jewish tradition that my husband and I practiced frequently, which is just studying together. One of the things I was going to mention earlier that's related to the Levinas idea as well as others is there's a liberational possibility in human relationships when two people are looking at a third thing. It's basic in conflict mediation as well. It's what Carter did. It's any number of different folks. And sometimes when you're looking at each other, that transformation can happen, but often it's harder. So if you turn to look at that third thing, it makes a difference. So but my husband and I are about to get in a fight, or actually it's true, if I have a deep disagreement with someone, I'll always say, what's the third thing that I can look at with them to make this better? It's related to the sphere, the second sphere outside the debate that you can always cultivate. And I think more broadly, for us right now, the most important thing just to begin, and I think we have to think of ourselves in America right now as beginners, because we are being asked to reinvent what we understand America to be. That has been happening in the history of America over and over again. We are in that moment. So what if we looked at ourselves with all the charisma and energy and excitement of beginners trying to reinvent a new nation? And one of the most important things of that when you begin is how frightened you are to start, right? And so I think thinking about, the Buddhists would talk about it as giving it a cup of tea. Take your fear, understand that it's real. Take your fear of the public square and everything that it means, right? The guy that's abusing your Uber driver and you're furious, whatever it is. And take the fear, give it a cup of tea and say, okay, what I'm going to do today to reinvent America is to practice fearlessness, even if it's for 10 minutes, and see what that looks like. And that's what I think is the most important way that we can continue to inspire each other and ourselves.
There are just no words. I'm tearing up again. Did it at the beginning, doing it at the end. What an incredible, meaningful conversation, important conversation this has been. And we are just so grateful to you, Steve, as always, and to you, Laurie. Just what an amazingly wise evening this was. And thank you for being a part of it from the bottom of my heart. And so I will close. On behalf of our host, Florida Humanities, Village Square, and our streaming partners, we would like to thank you for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Honored to be with you.
Hey, Corey Nathan back here with you. This, as usual, just delivered the goods. I was taking notes throughout, so I figured I'd just share some of the bullet points that I jotted down, but we'd love to hear from you. Write in. Come to the next one. Let's talk about it. Or get together with somebody else who listened to this or was at the event and grab coffee with them, grab a beer with them, and just get together. I think that's kind of the point. One of the things that struck me that I wrote down is that since the 1700s, since our founding fathers, since this organization began, which is pretty cool, by the way, that Dr. Patton is a part of an organization that's been around since the 1700s. I think I got that right. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And that in some ways, we haven't changed. In some ways, we're grappling with some of the same basic problems and asking some of the same basic questions, which was an inspiration for the founding of this organization. We've got to gather. It's as simple as that. We've got to gather and pursue knowledge together. That's one of the first things I jotted down. and the imperative of pursuing our common good through debate. I think the assumption is that people of common affinities gather together to echo each other's affinities, echo each other's where they agree with each other. But we pursue knowledge. We pursue solutions through our differences, through debate. And similarly, getting at problems by thinking in multiple ways. So across multiple disciplines, or having different pursuits, different ways to enter into a problem, a big problem that affects many of us. And that by synthesizing, whether it's across disciplines or different angles from within an individual discipline, the example was used by addressing the AIDS epidemic, and that there were different ways to rethink that even within medicine. But getting at problems by thinking in multiple ways. And democracy is it takes time. It's deliberative, and these democratic renovations, as Danielle Allen would put it, it takes time, and that's okay. We're not going to be able to snap our fingers and change the entire universe instantaneously. It takes time. And along those lines, one of the things I really loved was thinking about the way that Heschel would describe it is the profundity in the mundane. But all three of our speakers, Liz and Dr. Patton and Steve, were all talking in different ways about the grand versus the mundane, or the national and the local. I love the examples where Liz was just delighted about Dr. King and the mundane of, and I'll send in the application fee. That delighted me as well. Or Marian Anderson teaching music lessons. This incredible woman, this historic woman with a worldwide platform, was teaching music to kids. Just in her community. She was very community centric. And then, of course, the story about Einstein going to get coffee in his pajamas and his slippers. It humanizes these folks, these historic figures, which is wonderful. And the other thing that I loved the question, what do we owe each other? What do we owe each other? And there wasn't really one answer, but it is one of the challenges of our time, and apparently across many generations. We have to ask ourselves, are we up to the task? Are we up to the challenge of holding each other in the midst of our differences? Can we hold each other in the midst of our differences? Can we hold onto our relationships in the midst of our differences? Because as it was said, we need those differences in order to make these advances, in order to debate, in order to wrestle through different solutions to big problems. And then the connective tissue is humanizing each other. So in a digital world, in an AI world, we can use all of these platforms. We can use all of these things as tools if we're using it to enhance actual relationships. And if we lean into face-to-face, IRL, as they say, in real life, if we lean into, as much as possible, actually seeing folks. And then if we are using social media, beat the algorithms. We can beat the algorithms. How do we do that? By using it as a way to enhance actual relationships. So those, you could tell, it got me really thinking. This was I don't want to go on too long, but I just wanted to share some of the thoughts with you, because it really was, there was so much here. But that's those are some of the things I was thinking about, and it'd be great to continue the conversation and nurture our relationships. So with that, it's time to close out today. Please consider joining our members in supporting this program. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. Go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. That's villagesquare.us/donate. While you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Go to villagesquare.us, villagesquare.us, and scroll to the bottom for the sign-up box. And there's also a pop-up box when you first go to the site, so they make it super easy to stay tuned in, to stay plugged in. Village Squarecast is funded in part by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with support from the Mellon Foundation and Florida Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities. Learn more about Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. We appreciate you listening to Our Common Purpose with Dr. Laurie Patton. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.